indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Reynolds are excused. Supervisor Chair Gibbs, Lumber, and Marshall, and myself present here. So, public comments. We approach you, so does anybody wish to make public comments? Thank you. If not, we'll move on to the minutes of the meeting. We have the minutes from the 9th and the 14th. I just had a question relative, did we number the amendments? And I didn't go back in and check because the minutes just reflect the action on an amendment. But are we numbering them?
We had the amendment that, yes, that was Amendment 1.
Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to request that it says the amendment to the amendment was defeated, but it does not describe the amendment. I think the amendment to the amendment should have a description as including the additional $157,000 of miscellaneous revenue from the treasurer's office, if
Can
I could, please.
Can I suggest that perhaps what we might want to do is deal with the minutes from the 9th?
That
Today,
is the
and then
minutes of the 9th.
And then delay the meeting minutes from which one was it, the
The
action?
14th was the one that was last week's with the amendment to the amendment. It was the 14th.
And take up the 14th and we'll get a chance to correct it at the next meeting? So
Well, I need direction on how to
I
correct it
can
from the
work
committee.
with you.
All right.
I'll work with her. I understand your request, and I think what we want to do is make sure we've delineated what the purpose of the amendments were. And we'll work with the clerk and correct those, update those, and get those out. So I would ask for, what are your wishes relative to the minutes from the October 9th meeting? Moved by Supervisor Lemmer to approve. Is there a second? Second by Chair Gibbs. Any discussion on the minutes of the October 9th? If not, all those in favor of approval of those minutes will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries. And again, we'll bring the minutes from the 14th back, and it will deal with clarification of the amendment and the amendment to the amendment, and provide that to you. I think that would be easier than trying to wordsmith it today, and we can go back in and capture that. All right. Item 6A, 1, claims disallowance, Keith Bowers. Dan, are you going to provide an overview, or it's in the packet, a recommendation for denial based upon a tree branch hitting a truck, and WEMIC recommends denial? Any questions relative to the claim? What are your wishes? Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion to deny the claim by Keith Bowers, consistent with recommendations from our insurance carrier.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the claim disallowance will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries. Northern Mobile Home Park funding pre-demolition inspections with HRC contingency fund. Administrator Leonard, or Chris?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. So this item is seeking the use of the committee's contingency funding in order to perform the pre-demolition inspections and testing you need to do on that site before any work was done. So we've identified this step has to happen regardless of any path that we move forward on at this point, but is currently held up with the human health hazards that are on site through the health department. So there's a grander discussion involving the location, but nevertheless, regardless of path, this is teed up for the next step for the property. And so it was just identifying a funding source in order to move it forward. If the funding is provided, you can see in the quote that there's a range from 18,000 to 26,000. That's essentially just based on how many tests they end up having to do. There's 47 mobile homes. The site is a relatively large site overall. But then the turnaround should be approximately 6 weeks, which then tees up, again, the next steps of the discussion.
Chair Gibbs.
Just a question. Now, I know there was, in essence, some payments that were being made on some back taxes. Are we still in a position to be able to foreclose on that property and take that property because of the 3 back years property tax delinquent in tax in REM?
I don't know, Connie, if you want to add, but I believe the short answer is yes. They have not sufficiently paid off their,
Yeah, we haven't received anything. Only the 5,000. That was it.
Go ahead.
And the 5,000 was applied to
The oldest year.
the oldest year? Thank you.
Right. Is this consistent with our procurement policy, Dan? Given the amount, I think we're still below the thresholds.
yeah,
Do we,
Chris worked with Mike on that, yeah.
Yeah, it is consistent based on conversation with Corp Counsel in terms of you're at the $25,000 threshold potentially, but it's close enough there. But there's also the fact that in this area, there's really only one main vendor that performs these duties. There's other vendors that do the abatement and things like that, but for the inspections and testing, there's primarily one.
okay.
So, and I'm assuming Mike said then that's a sole source procurement. We would just have to document it and then we'd be fine.
Correct. We can provide that documentation.
Any questions? So this begins the process of inspecting the trailers for asbestos and would allow us to determine the next approach once the results are in. Supervisor Marshall.
And then the cost of this is added as a special assessment to the property. Is that correct? Connie? Is that added as a special assessment on the tax bill, the cost of this?
Yes. Or, I mean, the county can take it however they want. They could try to bill them, or they can put it on the tax bill. That's a choice.
Chair Gibbs.
Well, I think the recommendation would be to include it as a special on the property tax, because if we try to bill them and they do not pay, I think the challenge becomes that we may sit in line behind other creditors in that situation, whereas if we at least put it on the property tax and eventually do take the property, because it's a special on the property tax, we can recollect on an eventual resale if that's, but I would be asking Administrator Corp Counsel if my understanding is correct.
So just to, again, clarify kind of where we're at, we haven't started the tax foreclosure process yet. This is in response to the human health hazard abatement order that the court granted last month. So the thought here is to proceed with the use of these funds to get the testing done that would then inform the request for proposals that would be sent out to actually procure, consistent with our procurement policy, the cleanup of those trailers, whatever that might look like, to be in compliance with the abatement order. And if you bear with me, we'll find the abatement order, but my recollection of the language that
Yeah, so I have it here.
very wise Corp Counsel provided in the abatement order was that costs associated with cleanup could be added to the property consistent with what you're requesting, Supervisor Marshall. I think it's the last paragraph of that order.
Yeah, so it's going to say, within 30 days of the date of this order, the court authorizes Marathon County, without further order of the court, to enter upon the premises in order to abate, remove, or correct all human health hazards present, and to collect the cost of abatement or removal from defendant Sustainable Resources LLC, including by imposing said cost as a special assessment, special charge, or other levy associated with the subject premises. And to just kind of give you more of a background here, in addition to this abatement, we also have a $49,500 forfeiture. When we discussed this with Corporation Counsel Michael Purner, we're probably going to kind of take a bifurcated approach. So we're going to follow the order and do the abatement. We're also going to send notices required to take the property on a tax deed as necessary. In addition to that, what we're going to do is we're going to docket the judgment for $49,500, as well as these other special costs and assessments in the county where the property is located, and that just gives us more options down the road, depending, if they pay the taxes, they might not pay the forfeiture, and then we might have to proceed on that forfeiture and foreclose on that as well. So just giving us more options down the road.
So is it a lien? Or how is it recorded?
So right now, when it's recorded, it serves as a judgment lien. You docket the judgment in the county in which the property is located, and at that point, once the judgment is docketed, it will serve as a lien against all property of the defendant in that county.
If you're going to put a special charge on it, I guess I'm looking to see what you would like that to be listed as, because we have several charges. I mean, we can add one, but because the county's putting it on there, just want to know what you want it to be labeled as. And secondly, I would have, if there is any charges from now till November 25th, I would need that by November 25th to get onto the tax bill. That special charge, if there is any.
Well, I think we have to wait on that because we don't know what those charges are going to
Yep,
be yet.
but
That's
I'm
going to
just-
depend on the nature of the abatement, and I think there's still going to be, we need to get a quote. And so, yeah, I don't know that we're going to have that before November.
Yeah.
But I think the question becomes one is, are we phasing the specials in, is one of your special assessments relative to human health hazard abatement?
I'd have to look, because, I mean, most of our specials are generated from municipalities. We only have a few that we actually put on there, so, I mean, we can always add one if we needed to.
So you could, in your review, look for the best fit and.
Yep.
and-
But I just wanted the board to know that if there was any charges from now, I mean, if things went on smoothly and you have charges, I would need them by November 25th.
So just again, in terms of operationally, what the next step for this committee would be is authorizing us, providing a funding source for us to get the testing needed to then go forward and draft an RFP to proceed with abating the human health hazard. The tax foreclosure and all this other stuff we're talking about is, we'll certainly have more conversations on this property, but the first thing that needs to happen to essentially move forward with the human health hazard mitigation effort is the testing of those trailers as provided in the quote that Chris got for you. And essentially to fund that, you have a $50,000 annual contingency that you approved as part of your 2024 budget. To this point, you have not expended any funds from that contingency. So this is a request for a motion to, for this committee to authorize the expenditure of those funds for purposes of moving forward with the testing outlined in the packet.
So the motion would be to authorize the transfer of funds from the Finance Committee's contingency fund not to exceed $26,900 for the purposes of completing the asbestos pre-demolition inspection, consistent with the human health order and violation at Northern Mobile Home Park on Grand Avenue in Schofield. Chair Gibbs.
I make a motion to authorize not to exceed $26,900 to do the asbestos pre-demolition inspection on the properties at 281 Grand Avenue, Schofield, Wisconsin,
To come out of the contingents.
to be used from the HR Finance $50,000 contingency fund.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Lammer. Any discussion? Inherent in that motion is the concept of cost recovery that we will deal with or I think implied in that is that we would pursue cost recovery and it would be a special assessment. Dan, do we need additional clarification on that in the motion?
In the motion, I don't think you need that. We're already working to kind of brainstorm those options.
Any questions? If not, all those in favor of the motion to approve use of the contingency fund for the asbestos pre-demolition inspection at 281 Grand Avenue in Schofield will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you. Item 6B1, resolution approving sale of 405 South 8th Avenue, Wausau. Administrator Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You'll see that within your packet is the offer that was received from the City of Wausau relative to the property that we've discussed. Specifically on page 22 of your packet, there are the additional provisions and contingencies noting that the offer to purchase is contingent upon Community Development Authority Board resolution, which my understanding is they've met to approve this. The buyer also agrees to develop the property within 36 months of closing, and the seller retains the right to repurchase the property at the purchase price if not developed within 36 months of closing. So this is on your board agenda for ultimate approval later today, but because it is a revised offer consistent with the general discussion you had, I wanted to make sure it was brought before this committee before going to the board.
Any questions of administration? I think we've talked about it before. Any questions? If not, what are your wishes? Supervisor Lemmer.
I'll make the motion to approve the resolution and pass it on to the full board of the sale of 405 South 8th Avenue.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Poole. Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of adoption of the resolution will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries. Consideration of adopting high-cost placement reserve policy within the Social Improvement Fund. Administrator Leonard.
Sure, I can tee this up. We talked about this, or I referenced this in my budget presentation about the challenges that are posed by high-cost placements. And within your packet on page 24 is a resolution essentially outlining the establishment, a policy establishing a reserve. And again, I think I won't belabor the point. I talked about it in the budget presentation. The simple fact is that the costs for these placements are growing, and they are exceedingly high already. They continue to grow. And in light of budget pressures, we do have this desire, and I think it's prudent practice to budget tighter with respect to placements relative to our actual experience. But with that comes the risk of, if you have an experience such that, you budget for half a year of a placement at Lincoln Hills, and the cost for a placement of a child at Lincoln Hills is set to increase by more than 80%. It can truly have a very detrimental impact on the county budget, and then you're trying to identify a funding source, perhaps it's contingency or perhaps it's a general fund. So setting up essentially a segregated funding source for these placements, I think makes sound fiscal sense. The resolution in your packet on page 24 sets that reserve at the amount of $400,000, as I referenced in the budget. Certainly, if you care to modify that and increase that dollar amount, I certainly wouldn't think that would, I think that's also a logical conversation for you to have, because again, the cost of a correctional care placement is set to increase to $800,000. So the costs are substantial. And you'll see also level 5 treatment foster care is just shy of $600,000 annually. So one or two of those placements beyond your budget, and you're certainly in a fiscal predicament. This is not unusual. I will tell you that there are other counties in the state that have adopted similar practices. And in fact, and I'll bring more information to this committee at a later date relative to the levy exceptions that exist for court-ordered placements. I have to do some additional follow-up on that and just learn more, but suffice to say, these placements are a budget challenge for every county.
Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when I totaled this table up, it came to just under $2 million. Is $400,000 enough? That's number one question. And then number two, I assume Social Services Board and maybe Health and Human Services has discussed this. What was that conversation like, if that has happened?
I actually don't. I'll start with the latter point of your statement. I'm not sure that it's gone through Social Services Board and Health and Human Services. It's truly at its core, it's a fiscal policy. With respect to totaling up that column, that's just the average cost of a single placement. If you look in your budget book, what you budget annually for placements is far in excess of that number. It's just shy of $6 million. So if you'd like us to have this conversation go back to those other bodies, we certainly can do that. But your 2025 budgeted total cost in the budget that was out for publication is $5,820,110 for placements.
So just a quick question to follow up. You indicated that the correctional care was now 800,000, but you're reflecting 474 in the resolution.
That is the current cost for the correctional placement. The Department of Corrections and the Department of Children, and I believe it's just the Department of Corrections, put out their projected increases beginning July of 25.
Okay.
This is my recollection. Oh, and Sam, I think, has it in the resolution in the second paragraph. Proposed changes that will potentially increase the correctional care rate by 82% for the 2025 to 27 Department of Corrections biennial budget. So that 474 number is current state. But that, all indications are that's increasing.
Chair Gibbs.
So, so the way I understand this is this is effectively a contingency fund out of the social services account to account for anything that is above and beyond what we budget for. If that were to be the case, we get any one of these situations or multiple of these situations to fund those without having to dip into reserve, and we'll replace this. This is a policy, and we'll replenish any used funds out of the 400,000 in any subsequent year out of any unused funds from the Social Services Department from labor or whatever it may be in the future years. Is that correct?
So will this require, if we exceed it, a transfer in the year that the transfer from the reserves occurs?
Correct.
So we will have, this will set up the reserve, but the actual execution of the transfer will need to come back to this body and the board, correct?
Yes.
Chair Gibbs.
Well, would it have to, if it's predetermined that it's for this specific and it's reserved for that specific reason, would it have to come? I would think if we used that 400 up and we had to dip into working capital or reserves to fund any high place cost, that would come before the board. But would any use of this reserve account actually really need a board action? Because it's already
From an audit
earmarked.
perspective, would we not need to have corresponding action associated with that?
Correct. In order to use the reserve, it's a budget amendment to take it from there. And if it's over 10% of the overall appropriation from the original budget that was approved, it needs to go through full board approval.
So what we're doing is just setting aside a portion of that, requiring, again, subsequent action prior to the expenditure of those funds. Any other questions? I think, again, this is a reflection of us budgeting tighter and tighter. So what are your wishes? Chair Gibbs.
I'll make a motion that we establish a reserve and social improvement fund to be used for out-of-county placements and set that limit at 400,000 as it's defined today.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Marshall. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of adopting the high-cost placement reserve policy and setting aside $400,000 will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries. Consideration of amendment of the 2024 annual budget to reallocate and/or encumber American Rescue Plan Act funds.
So Chris is going to hand out a document to you. This is just, again, to continue the conversation. We anticipate having a final document that hopefully will work through your budget amendment process. We will make sure we send it by email to anyone who's attending virtually, but we'll get it in your packet for the next meeting. This is, again, just for, well, I don't know that we want you to forward it on to the full board this time, because it's not going to be in your meeting for this month anyway. But what Chris and Sam have put together is essentially a table that outline where we are currently with our ARPA spend, and then what amount do we need to essentially unencumber to then re-encumber those unutilized funds toward a project. And in this instance, we are recommending the use of those funds for the Regional Forensic Science Center project to essentially mitigate the need to use the social improvement funds that were previously authorized. So with that summary, I'll kick it over to Chris and Sam. I probably stole all of the thunder. But again, this is consistent with the discussion this committee's had about how to make sure that we essentially don't forfeit any ARPA funds. And this would be done through a 2024 budget amendment, as opposed to addressing it as it was not addressed in your 2025 budget.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, other than I tried to keep it simple conceptually. Now, the concept can change, obviously, and that's what's up for discussion, but effectively supplanting the funds that were made available by the board previously to help fund the Regional Forensic Science Center project with the ARPA funds, that then cleans up the ARPA fund account so that when you hit the 12/31/24 deadline, you're in a good spot. Now, on the table there, you see some things that were already previously unencumbered in 2023, and then with the additional table of 2024 CIP projects, and then a few other projects that have been authorized this year or in previous years where we identified additional funding that could be unencumbered. So what I did there is reached out to all the departments that had ARPA-funded projects and said, where are you at? Where do you think you will be if you're going to be crossing over into 2025? Or if you're done, how much is left over that can be reallocated? And that's what's in the far right under the 2 unencumbered column. And then just using those numbers to then tally up, okay, here's what's been spent, here was our total allocation, and then ultimately the bottom line there at $2.3 million is what's left in the ARPA pool. Essentially, this is not spending the ARPA per se, but if you were going to spend the $2.3 million out of the Social Improvement Fund or ARPA, this would mean you'd spend the ARPA first, which has been the guiding principle for any project with ARPA funds in the first place.
Just a quick check-in on the PSE broadband grants to unencumber. You're unencumbering the Frontier grant, but I think that there may have been $70,000 for Serenity that was not done, that we would need to unencumber as well.
The 70,000 was, I believe, previously unencumbered in 2022.
Okay, so we have unencumbered it. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
It does muddle the picture a little bit by including everything, but I wanted you to see the whole picture, like everything that's happened with ARPA from last year through to this year.
Okay, any other, is this for action today or for, more for education today with the thought that we would then at the subsequent meeting?
I think from my point of view, and the administrator can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's mostly for education, but to kind of prime the pump in terms of like, what are the thoughts here? This is a very simple way to utilize ARPA funds and then take the social improvement funds out from underneath the obligation that's been previously authorized, so that then you've disposed of the worry, so to speak, of any ARPA funds not being expensed or encumbered by the deadline.
And I would just say as an operational piece, I mean, it's not on your board agenda this month, so you certainly don't gain anything by acting today. It's not going to happen in front of the full board any earlier than if you did act today or if you put it to your next meeting. But really, we want to make sure we're hitting the mark in terms of what your direction was. I think Sam and Chris did a great job, again, trying to keep it simple, but also lay out all the necessary information. The true idea here is make sure we don't leave any ARPA funds on the table. We want to make sure we sufficiently encumber and allocate all funds by that deadline.
Chair Gibbs.
Chris, on the 2024 projects, we've got basically 5 different projects, 180 for CCIT, Eastgate Hall, and so on. All of those projects are closed out, I'm assuming, and that's why we know that that's the unencumbered, that's the amount to unencumber?
Correct. I had discussions with each department head and any of the finance staff they have to get that exact number. So like the CCITC number is 2 different projects. One they didn't actually do. One came in at a lower rate. Eastgate Hall is effectively closed. The dump station effectively closed. Marathon Park, there were a couple outstanding items they needed to do, so we worked through a bunch of math to get to where the balance was now, and then worked that out to get to the number you see there. And then same deal with the Cherokee Park bathroom replacement that came in under.
Any other questions? I think in light of the fact that we've just seen it and there's not a need to act on it today, to give us a chance to digest it, if we could hold it off to the next meeting without objection. Chair Gibbs?
I was just going to make a motion to postpone until the next HR Finance Committee meeting so that we can do the same, just exactly what you said, and then possibly move it to the full board for action.
There's a motion to postpone until the next meeting. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Poole. Any discussion on the motion? If not, all those in favor of postponing will signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, discussion and potential amendments to the 2025 annual budget. Amendments to reflect necessary transfer between funds and indirect costing allocation in the Highway Department budget. Sam?
Hi. So we have two amendments here. I'll go through the first one. In the general fund, we did budget for transfers from the general fund and the ending fund. In this case, it'd be the CIP fund and the employee benefits fund. And we also had budgets in departments for carryovers or planned carryovers, but we did not have the budget in there from the general fund to allocate those amounts. So what this proposal would do would put that number in the overall budget. On the second page, or the highway one, originally that was put in as a contra expenditure account. So a contra expenditure account is a negative expenditure account. What this one will do is take it from that contra expenditure account and put it into a revenue account.
And the impact on the budget is,
Zero impact to the levy, but it will increase the overall budget by $9,523,241 in the general fund and $6,771,047 in the highway fund.
and these are, more or less correctional
Correct.
in nature.
Yes.
Any questions for Sam, for the finance director? Supervisor Lemmer.
Sorry, but I have no idea what this is, so I can't ask any questions. I'm just trusting the cleanup is needed, and so it's procedural.
Yes. What it is it's the reserves amount that then becomes part of the budget. If we didn't do this, we'd have to have a budget amendment next year that would, again, go through full board approval to put that in there so that we could properly record the transfers out.
Chair Gibbs.
So the way I understand this is that it was always contemplated and anticipated to use these funds when we built the budget to begin with. It was the housekeeping of accounting that is now properly being documented in these two amendments.
Yes, sir.
So we're not acting on it today. Again, it's here for educational purposes, but again, it was, I think Administrator Leonard, shortly after the budget was introduced, indicated that we needed to go back in and correct some of these. I think what we would want to do is perhaps before the public, can we amend the budget document to reflect these or not in light of the publication of the notice?
What we can do is, I haven't given any thought to that. My sense is just legally you can't amend anything right now, but we can put proposed amendments on our webpage. We did include a link to Budget Amendment 1, which was adopted prior to the publication of the budget. We can put this on the website, just noting that these will be considered by the full board in connection with consideration of the full budget. And again, just from my side, I think you laid it out very well, Mr. Chair. These were, and Chair Gibbs, these were contemplated in the building of the budget. This is an accounting remedial exercise to essentially have the transfers noted from the requisite funds, at least for the general fund side. They're in the department budgets already. So, and then the highway side, I think Sam laid out it's truly an accounting change, just from a contra account to a general revenue approach. But again, I largely like you, Supervisor Lemmer. I trust Sam on the accounting side. We build the budget just in terms of going through and checking departmental budgets for revenues and expenditures. This is on the kind of one step removed from that.
Chair Gibbs.
I'll make a motion to.
I'm sorry, but notice is an educational item, so a motion would not be in order.
And these are just to let you know that they will be coming at your HR finance meeting when you consider all the, I believe your practice is you consider all proposed amendments and can weigh in. We're just bringing them to you early to let you know they're coming.
Sorry for interrupting, but so I think we also can talk. I did have a conversation with the administrator and just would like to have a discussion because there were a couple of departments' budgets that stood out relative to increases, and specifically the sheriff in terms of the levy and the medical examiner. And we just have a discussion as the rationale behind that. And some of those are associated with transferring positions from the DA's office and the Rib Mountain. But I just think it would be healthy for all of us to hear as to why those were higher levy asks than others. So, Administrator Leonard?
Sure, I think Sam and I can take it. I think largely you referenced within the sheriff's office what some of those clear increases are. I'll start with the medical examiner side, and then Sam, if you want to elaborate on the sheriff's office. The medical examiner, simply put, is we budgeted for the additional position that was approved as part of your 2024 budget amendment process, and that is a forensic pathologist, which will be the most expensive position you have in the county when that individual is hired. There were also some attendant expenses necessary with the implementation, the planned implementation of the Regional Forensic Science Center. I also put in the budget message that while we've incorporated a number of things that we know are coming, there will be a quite large, I would call it a comprehensive budget amendment relative to the implementing our Regional Forensic Science Center model relatively early in the year when we do reclasses of all of the positions that currently exist within that office. Medical Examiner Blahnik will come before you, and essentially we're taking an office that right now is commonly referred to as a lay office and transitioning to a professional office. So what that's going to mean is that our death investigator positions will still perform a great deal of those duties, but we will have a number of other positions that don't exist right now. We'll have a director of operations that doesn't exist right now. We will have autopsy, at least one autopsy technician. We will have livery service employees for body transport. And as part of that whole process, we're going to engage our HR staff to make sure we reclass those positions appropriately and bring them to this body and ultimately the full board for a budget amendment. But that'll come relatively early in the year, but nevertheless, there were a number of changes to their budget just because we do envision hiring a forensic pathologist. Hopefully, early in 2025, if not making an offer yet in 2024 for that individual or individuals to help us get our operations up and running. So that's the medical examiner side. I don't know, Sam, if there's anything apart from the additional sheriff's office employees that were referenced, the transfer of the positions from the district attorney's office, as well as, one policy we've had that we've used intermittently is budgeting for attrition within that office, and we didn't do that this year. But anything else you want to highlight relative to sheriff's office?
Just a slight increase in the WRS rate. It is on the protective side, so that was a 0.1% increase, and then just the health insurance increases and all the subsequent retirement and Social Security, Medicare taxes that are associated with such.
Administrator Leonard, I would just ask that when you bring in the updated numbers and the request for relative to the medical examiner, that include a pro forma relative to the revenues that will be generated as a result of our having this regional center, so that we can get a better feel of the net impact of that to tax levy versus revenues that'll be generated from other counties. And if you could build that pro forma, I think we saw some of those numbers in the presentations leading up to the approval, but I think if we could capture them at that time, that would be helpful. Chair Gibbs.
I think a lot of those were reflective in the business plan, so I think, bringing that before the board also would be helpful.
Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that we've also had a conversation, at least with Administrator Leonard, on that if Marathon County is the one putting the capital in for the building, that there should be a two-tiered system. We should not be charged the same for autopsies as those surrounding counties who do not have capital in the enterprise building. So if I could ask that we have a two-tier system, recognizing that we have a significant investment here, and the people receiving the services from other counties do not.
Appreciate it. Chair Gibbs.
Well, I think the budget amount is the operational cost, and I don't think there's fees to the decedent's family for autopsies, is there?
No, but I think Supervisor Marshall, you're referencing kind of the idea that, at least when throughout this process of kind of building those pro formas, the idea of how do we get capital contributions from surrounding counties. There was initially the thought of essentially I'm going to probably choose the wrong word here, but kind of an investor group. If you invest in the capital and fund the capital, you'd perhaps get a lower rate for autopsies. I'll make sure when we bring the pro forma in that we demonstrate clearly what the cost, what the charge will be for exterior customers, both with respect to forensic autopsies and medical autopsies, and then also reflect what our budgeted costs, because certainly in the pro formas that were done, and this predates me, this was under the previous administrator was when they started doing these pro formas, but it was certainly still envisioned that Marathon County would allocate levy funds that you currently allocate for purposes of funding the cost for us to procure autopsies from outside providers, to continue to budget appropriately for those costs to be performed internally. But I think to your point, I will certainly highlight what, if any, difference exists between what our costs to deliver, or what we're, for lack of a better term, billing ourselves, and what we're charging outside entities. So certainly understand that. I'll make sure we bring in an updated fee schedule as well. That'll be one thing we need to amend. We'll be laying out what are the requisite fees for the services we're going to provide. And I really envision this running, and we'll work with Sam on this. It's going to be a quasi-enterprise account. I mean, it's not going to be full cost recovery. The pro formas that were built never envisioned this Regional Forensic Science Center existing off levy. It was always built with those pro formas, understanding that there would continue to be a levy allocation, but the hope was that it would run, and the intent was to set it up to run essentially at a cost neutral proposition, that we would not have to allocate significant additional levy to that Forensic Science Center. So when we bring that in, I think I understand you, Supervisor Marshall, that going to make sure we highlight those pieces.
Any other questions relative to the budget? And again, there would be the discussion. We're in this freeze, and unfortunately, this is a good time as any. We had a glitch relative to the publication of the budget. Administrator Leonard or Sam, do you want to talk through that and what it might mean?
So you're moving on to, I guess 7A. So when one thing is good, two things are better. So I think the intent is to move forward with 2 public hearings. We had engaged the local paper to procure publication, as has been our longstanding practice, and our understanding of that conversation myself, Sam, and Corporation Counsel Purner was that we were assured that it would be published sufficiently in advance to meet the 15-day deadline for your current November 1st public hearing. We received an affidavit of publication with a different date listed, so we'll still continue to hold. I spoke with Chair Gibbs and Chair Robinson. The county board will continue to hold the November 1st public hearing, as that has been communicated widely in numerous media outlets. But also just to ensure that we are in compliance with statute, Sam is reaching out to publish a notice for a second public hearing to be held on November 11th. And in speaking with Chair Gibbs and conferring with legal counsel, we will envision having the county board take action at the November 1st public hearing, following the close of the public hearing, directing the HR Finance and Property Committee to hold a second public hearing on November 11th at 3 p.m., which is the time scheduled for your standard meeting. That'll allow the public, should they wish to have another opportunity to offer feedback, to do so. But in terms of the annual budget itself, I think the chair has already kind of laid out what that process will look like. Historically, any amendments that are going to be offered, your process has been to ask those individuals to work with finance director, corporation counsel, or administrator to make sure that they are in the appropriate form and ensure the budget would remain balanced. But then your committee has the opportunity to essentially review those amendments and elect whether to take a position to support, not support, or take no position, I guess, is certainly the third option that would be available to you prior to the formal consideration and adoption of the budget, which is scheduled for the following day, which will be on November 12th.
In light of the time frame, I think we'll have to be somewhat flexible relative to the timing of requiring amendments to be in beforehand, because I think there may be issues and ideas that are generated as a result of the second public hearing that may result in amendments at that time, and we'll have to be fluid, flexible, and timely relative to our consideration. But again, this is our resolution requires us to publish with the paper. There's a statutory publication period. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, it wasn't published when we thought it was going to be published, and therefore we want to be in compliance with both the statutes and provide adequate notice. We'll have the two hearings on the 1st and the 11th. So it will not result in an additional meeting for us, but rather potentially a little bit more elongated meeting on the 11th, but hopefully not. So any questions relative to that process? Good reason for us to look at changing our resolution, and perhaps this, I don't think anybody goes to the paper anymore to get the legal notices for the budget hearings. We use our website and others, but there's continues to be remnants of the past and requirements from the past, and we have discussed internally whether or not we can change that practice going forward, and we'll evaluate that and potentially bring something to the county board outside of the budget cycle to address it. Any other questions relative to the budget? We have the KIP as a separate item, although it is part of the 2000 the budget. But then we also have the 5-year capital plan, which we've asked Deputy Administrator Holman to present. Why don't we run on to that? We can go back to the budget if that spurs additional discussion. So, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what you see on the screen and in the packet is the 5-year CIP plan that was presented previously this year, but I've updated it to reflect where we are at in the process. Oh boy, maybe I should come up there. So the 2025 proposed column is effectively what you've seen to date. The adopted column will get filled in after budget adoption so that then the document will stay updated for future conversations. And then looking ahead, you've got what are effectively budget estimates for planning purposes. The recurring projects are all essentially the same. I did increase rolling stock with a 3% assumption. I think that's probably, at least based on the last 5 years, it'll probably be in that 3% to 4% range moving forward. And then moving down through the different departmental areas, you've got everything that departments have currently identified as future projects on their calendars. I do know that Highway has a much more robust, actually no, I did include everything on theirs too, down here on the right. But Highway does a really wonderful job of planning for the future as well. So there may still be projects that pop up that aren't listed here, but just because they're not on anybody's radar. Similarly, if there's to be determined, it's just because there hasn't been a budget estimate we've done. I do think that as this document evolves, you need to account for things like inflation so that you get a sense of where the estimates are increasing over time, but then in each year prior to the more in the weeds discussions about the projects, actually do a budget estimate update so that the document is based on real world data as of that year versus the sort of annual pegging to inflation. So the other thing that this form versus the other form that you've seen, the spreadsheet with the colors and all that, breaks that down for this year's capital or next year's capital budget, and it also breaks down the revenue where it's coming from. So you'll see a couple numbers that look a little bit different, but that's just by the fact that this sheet doesn't currently break out if there's different funding streams for a particular project, notably in Highway. That's where you get some state, federal funds that also get tagged in but are lumped together in the numbers you see on this document. The other thing for this moving forward, and I should add a caveat, this week I was notified that there's an increasingly stronger chance that we may move to another software platform for CIP, which may impact this data and how it's compiled. But I think based on what I know of that program, a lot of what you see here can probably move forward. And I think there's still some merit to breaking out the projects on individual project forms that are different from what you've seen historically, so that you can have a sheet that then breaks down the revenue or breaks down the funding by where it's coming from for each particular project, and gives some pictures and things like that so you can see what's going on. I think that's about it. In terms of projects that were delayed this year or have been delayed thus far, I've highlighted those in the action category, and also noted if they're new or regulatory, similar to what you've seen in the other documents. The other thing I'll note too is that you'll see in 28, there's a $54 million project. That's another estimate based on more up-to-date conversations for a highway facility. So that's obviously going to distort the number you see at the bottom of the column for that year. The other thing I'll mention is just that in terms of practice, when it comes to the committee and board's decisions for planning, also funding availability, these planning only columns, the reason I kind of try to call that out the way I do is that these projects can move around quite a bit based on priorities, based on things that come up that may take a higher priority than some of the items that are already listed there. But from a facilities perspective, the large item, sort of higher cost projects that are remaining to do that we've identified are all in there, and that's similar for the other departments that you see and the projects that they've identified in their 5-year plans that they submit annually, or most of them submit annually with their CIP requests. So hopefully this document helps you see a broader picture in terms of what we know is coming down the pike in terms of projects and potential things that need funding. But again, the caveat there is that we do get, this year was a particularly bad one too for surprises in terms of things just not anticipating having to replace them, but then they go wrong.
Chair Gibbs?
So Chris, I know we've often talked about, end of life maintenance on HVAC systems, roofing, roofs. Have we projected in there, and I know we were supposed to have a computer system that was going to map out all of those items. Do we have those? I'm looking at, it looks as though the only end-of-life items that are projected are the ones that are in the 2025 budget. Is that correct?
Those are the only ones that I've labeled. Some of these, like replacing a chiller, those are going to be end of life based on what you'd assume. And to your question about the new asset management system, that we're just on the very beginning stages of that implementation. So based on what they're saying, the implementation of that will be 6 to 9 months in length, because we know right now we've got roughly 2,000 pieces of equipment that we need to not only upload into that system, but there's additional features like GPS and mapping and all different layers for the asset management. So those will track and ideally couple with this sort of planning document so that it will inform it. You'll see either routine maintenance come up or preventive maintenance, which should prolong the life, or even some of these that are slated for being replaced may in fact not need replacing that year based on, where you're at and what you see in that routine maintenance. Similar to the juvenile chiller that was added to the 2025 capital budget. It worked all right for the year, and then at the end of the cooling season, it just took a hard left turn that was not anticipated. But some of these things, they just, yeah.
Chris, I have a question relative to the campus. And earlier today, we had a meeting of the task force, and Administrator Leonard, Supervisor Marash, and I were there. But one of the discussions was whether or not we had a complete list of what the projected capital needs would be at that campus. Do you think that this is a comprehensive list of those items as we begin to look at what the options are going forward, or is this a sort of the identified list, but not necessarily based on an inspection of the building?
It's a great question. I would say based on our experience this and last year, that's the list of identified things that we know of now. But I would not be surprised if, as we get further and further in these buildings, we don't find something else that we need to add to the list. Like this year, we had a chiller that presented $25,000 in fixes we needed to do. So we're handling that this year, but it wasn't something that we knew about till we actually got into the building, saw what the situation was in, and needed to resolve that. But we've been going through there. We've got all their all the HVAC is now on our automated system, so that's useful. But we do going through it with a fine-tooth comb and kind of reprioritizing based on some of the things that are identified and not yet identified would certainly not hurt. But these are definitely big piece items that Bill and his team over there have identified.
Or that given the fact that you're not necessarily in the building as much as you are some of our buildings, I think it would be helpful for us just to have a better understanding of what the upcoming potential cost areas would be at the campus as we begin to have those discussions. And just as an aside, Supervisor Marash and I have had discussions, and we've, I think, referenced here the need for a joint meeting between the two committees, the Extension Education, Economic Development, and Human Resources, Finance, and Property, relative to the future of that the building. And there are some healthy discussions taking place relative to the potential future use, but they're only using 21% of the building space right now for campus activities, and that's not sustainable. So they're exploring, but we've reminded them repeatedly that we are the landlord, and we would want to be engaged in any decision relative to the future of that building. And there will be probably some recommendations that will begin additional community dialogue going forward. But one of the things we do need is that understanding of what the capital needs are at that campus.
Yeah, we can get on that, no problem. We've been doing kind of bits and pieces by area. We led with HVAC, and so we can continue moving down the line, and we'll do that.
Other questions relative to budget? I did have one question relative to this year's, or 2025 KIP. The cost for the UWMC improvements, the chiller, went up. Was that unforeseen or just inflationary, or?
A lot of it was inflationary. This area is the one that's experienced the highest percentage increase year to year regionally. So 6.1% is sort of the regional increase. This was also the cost driver for the Regional Forensic Science Center when those bids came back. So a lot of it's wrapped up in the year-to-year increase, so approximately 7-8%. We also added some controls that we hadn't been identified previously, and then we increased the contingency to just shy of 10% because of the volatility in what you'd expect to pay for mechanical, electrical, plumbing work.
All right. So any questions? Is the 6-year plan helpful, or the 5-year plan helpful in projecting out? Chair Gibbs.
Well, I think it is. I think what it brings to light is that, you know, without any bituminous in it, you know, you've got a constant capital need for the county to maintain the assets that it has at, you know, roughly $20 million plus a year. And, you know, our past practices has always been that we rolled over any unused budgeted funds into the CIP, but that only goes so far. And so I think this puts light to the fact that if we're going to maintain the properties that the county owns, and I think it's incumbent upon us as to do so, because it's just good business practice to maintain property. We've found how not maintaining it and putting things off sometimes ends up costing us in the long run, but it sheds a light on the out years that we're looking at 20 million additional at each year on a CIP requirement need.
Any other questions or comments? Again, it's here for informational item or purposes, and we will have a chance to review and amend the KIP at a future meeting. Thank you for pulling this together.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
It's very helpful and enlightening. All right. Any other questions relative to the budget as presented? And again, we'll have ample opportunities after the public input and that. Again, I'd like to thank the administrator and his team for their work on the budget. We'll go forward. All right. Update on addressing tax delinquent properties.
I'll start your day of very interesting spreadsheets and tables, I hope continue. If you start on page 31, and Erica's handing out stuff, and Connie, I'm sure we'll have more to add, but I just want to walk you through kind of what, in light of your direction that you provided to administration at your last meeting, and certainly some direction you gave to Connie, we'll talk through kind of the process, at least, that I think will get us started. Thank you very much, Erica. So this is the counterbook report as of a working document that I generated from the counterbook as of the 11th of this month. So with that caveat, I know that this is not accurate, but I did a lot of highlighting that took a lot of time and categorizing of things. So this is not a report I think that I'll update comprehensively in terms of running a new counter book frequently, because there's a lot of work on the back end. But let me just talk you through what I tried to do. So within, I put a key at the top that you'll see on the screen. And I tried to identify, I know there was a lot of discussion about sliver parcels, and I did part of the work here. A lot needs to be done. But anything highlighted in what I'll call a darker gray, I identified as a sliver parcel. And the way I did that is I looked for any address that was listed as 500 Forest Street, so the building we're all in right now, or it's listed as a property care of Marathon County. Now, I know that is not all of the slivers. I think it will behoove me to continue this, and I will, to identify, parcels, and you'll see a lot as you scroll through this document where the taxes owed are annually $3. That strikes me as likely a small little sliver parcel that is the result of enhancements in surveying over the many years that Marathon County has been surveyed and properties have been divided as such. But I started with those properties. Now, what is my plan is, again, to go to that next level and continue to identify those slivers. But working with Corporation Counsel's office, they're going to create from this document working documents for each subcategory that exist on my little categorization chart here. So I will then identify a strategy how to clean those up. That said, I don't want us to focus on them because, again, as I said at the last meeting, these are tax bills of $1, $2, $3, even if I pick a higher dollar amount, $50, they're slivers. And I know they're a challenge certainly for Connie and her staff, and it kind of distorts this counterbook report, so we'll clean it up. But I really want to take more time to go through the rest of the document. So the documents or the rows highlighted in red, and you see a couple here, they are also listed as 500 Forest Street, but that's because Connie, working with Corporation Counsel's office, those are the properties that went through our first batch of NREM. So I wanted to highlight that progress, but that's what the red is. Again, we're going to pull those off and continue to make sure that we then figure out what does disposition look like. But largely just to show you working off this document that progress has been made. Green is flagged as potential contamination. That are those 3 Weisenberger parcels that are referenced before. And I know Committee Chair Robinson has a document he was able to provide to me. I haven't been able to update this document with the information provided by Committee Chair Robinson, but there's a report you can run from a DNR website that has additional properties that are identified by the DNR as having potential contamination. So I will take a look at that and just see if any are listed here. But really, the thrust of our conversation I want to have about what remains on kind of my key here. You'll see that there are no parcels that are highlighted in either light blue or dark blue. Now, light blue is going to be batch 2, and that's the 89 properties that Connie and her team referenced that they've sent and received back from Runkle. And please correct me if I'm wrong on that, Connie, but that's the title research has been performed on those. I will, as soon as I get that information from Connie, go through and highlight those to, again, give you an update as to what that looks like on here. And Connie can talk through the timeline on what their tentative timeline is to proceed with that phase 2 or batch 2. Similarly, batch 3, which is sent out for title research, I'll flag those, color code those, and we'll develop a timeline for moving forward with those. My focus really was, and I should say with with the rest of the highlight, the yellow and the orange. In speaking with Connie, one thing that I think we both agree would benefit us in collecting back taxes. So the law is such, and Dan is here and he can elaborate if you have additional questions, but essentially we need a tax certificate that is at least 2 years old that then gives us the authority, in most circumstances, at least 2 years old, to proceed with either an in rem or a tax deed foreclosure action. So if you look right at the top of this sheet, I highlighted this property in yellow. They are not, the 2023 tax certificate that's issued is just shy of what is needed for us to proceed with a foreclosure action. So that's why I highlighted them in yellow. Our plan is to send them a letter letting them know, while they are not in batch 3, they're next. Sending them a letter saying tax delinquency notification, linking to our website so they can go find the amount that they owe, and they can take, essentially it's that friendly or certainly a terse reminder that they need to pay. So when I was going through this, you'll see the next one down is highlighted in orange. Now, initially when I highlighted them in orange, you'll see that I flagged it as problem to be further examined. Payments were applied to recent years when previous years remain unpaid. You know, I did a fair amount of reading of the statutes over the weekend and conferred with Mike and Dan early this week. The law, our longstanding practice has been that you need to have consecutive years of non-payment, recent years of consecutive years of non-payment to proceed with a tax foreclosure. But the law actually says that you're eligible for a tax foreclosure if that certificate again was issued and it's 2 years delinquent. You don't need to have 3 years of delinquency to proceed with a foreclosure. So initially flagged as a problem, but I'll go through and I'll update this sheet. That second property on that list from 2022, legally, we can actually proceed with a foreclosure. Now that dollar amount is $69.27, so it's probably a sliver. So I'll need to do some rework on that. But I wanted to just go through and flag these properties to start to show you what I think our opportunities are and where we need to spend our time. My sense is that you'll see as you scroll through this, and I don't want to go through in great detail, but there's a fair amount of these that I fully expect that will be on Connie's batch 2 and batch 3 list. So for example, this property, just picking one right here, this pin right in the middle, delinquent from 2019, 2020, 21, 22, 23, and 24. It looks to be a rather significant dollar amount. That it kind of strikes me as it's likely a full tax bill, or certainly a substantial portion of that tax bill. I didn't highlight it in yellow because I didn't want to go through the exercise of sending that friendly reminder when they're probably already going to get a friendly court notice from Connie and going through the court process. So once I get that additional information from Connie, I'll go through and highlight this and update it. But there's a fair number through batch 2 and 3 that I suspect will make some progress. My hope is that we'll also see some progress, and we'll report back to you relative to the reminder letters for these properties that are highlighted in yellow. I fully expect, I met with Mike this morning, Mike and Dan, we'll get a draft letter created and sent out. My goal is to have it sent out by the end of the first week in November. So November 7th-ish, we'll hope to have that friendly tax delinquency notification letter out, directing people to check our website and pay their delinquent amounts so as to not be in one of our future batches of or phases of that interim process. So that's kind of what I tried to accomplish through this letter. Again, I think once we get those additional 134 properties that Connie's got identified in batch 2 and 3, there will be a lot more color coding on that document, and we'll kind of walk through that from that's our strategy perspective. So the slivers, again, my plan is to engage conservation planning and zoning, to elaborate on that a little bit. Really, how do we best identify slivers, working between conservation planning and zoning and corporation counsel's office. Conservation planning and zoning has our surveyors. They're very tied into our towns, which is, I think, where probably more of these slivers, my assumption is more of these slivers are going to exist in more rural areas of the county, but we will develop a strategy and then implement that relative to the slivers. But I don't know what that strategy is going to look like yet, but I certainly envision it being CPZ, Corporation Council, and then quite honestly engaging town supervisors, town chairpersons, because they can engage those landowners. You know, you might, if I'm a landowner, maybe I don't want to add that 3-foot or 6-foot strip alongside my parcel. But that may be because I don't understand that it's going to be, it would otherwise be listed for sale on Wisconsin Surplus, and anyone can buy it and show up with a tent. So once that conversation is had, I think we'll have a fair number of these. My hope is we'll have a fair number of these kind of dealt with. So that is it from a high level of what I did with all the kind of the rainbow of colors on that sheet. And I know Connie just handed out kind of a timeline for, correct me if I'm wrong, is it batch 2? Okay. So certainly, if you guys have any questions for me, I'd certainly take them. But otherwise, Treasurer Beiersdorf, if you have anything to add on the process side.
So I presented the board with a time frame. So October, we're going to attempt to, that's the goal, to get all of those parcels in phase 2 out by the end of October. Then that starts the interim action. Basically, that's a 90-day payoff. So we have so from the end of October to, that would be the end of January. So that's where that's pushing you with the phase 2. Once the properties are returned to me from Runkle, that will be phase 3, and we're going to attempt to send those out as well. But in the meantime, we'll be watching all of those that are being paid. A lot of the times we send those notices out and we get payment. So that's kind of our goal. We would rather receive the payment. January, again, that's that I will give the file to the clerk of courts. That's when they actually have the list to look at, and then we update it prior to the hearing. That's what we did with the phase 1. So they at least have a list of what we're going to be taking, so they know and are aware of how many. February, March, that's when Corp Council will then, at that point, if we haven't received any money or anything from them, any notification from the owners, that's when we start the next phase with Corp Council. That's that 60-day notice of the actual foreclosure. And then we will determine at that time after January, the end of January, we'll determine how much is actually owed then. And that will be in that letter. And then in between that time, we can receive the payment. We can receive the payment up to the date of the hearing. So April, May is typically when we'd have the court hearing. And again, that also has to go with that Act 207. Any changes in the law, we have to make sure that's indicated in those notices. Because if it's not, we're going to have to reissue the notice, like in the past with the phase 1, that it'll get extended. So we have to make sure that, if there's any changes, we're noting that in that letter. And then potentially May is when we would be able to take that phase 2 properties. The court hearing will be April, May, and then hopefully by May, the phase 2, any of those properties will be able to be up for sale. But in the meantime, we're going to continue with phase 3 and then working with Corp Council in getting those notices out. And also, we discussed with Lance lengthily about potentially giving my list to Registered Deeds Office to find out who the lien holders are, so that we'll notify the banks as well, but higher up, possibly CEOs, which was recommended that we contact them of the banks to see if they'll look into their customers. We've also been contacted by Loretta Tax Service. They're also looking at their customers, and then they're also going to attempt to push those out to the mortgage holders. So we would also have their help.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The idea of notifying, my sense is one of the reasons we see a higher engagement rate with the court process or even the tax deed process when we provide notices, because it goes to any and all lien holders. So if you think of, if you were a bank and you had authored a mortgage that exists on a property and the individual wasn't paying, as is, at least was the case with my mortgage, it very clearly said that I needed to stay current on my tax obligations. You would take interest in that and you would engage that landowner. You would foreclose, as is your legal right, and at least as was the legal right in my mortgage, if that is not being paid, because you don't want to lose your interest, which would happen if we took it through the foreclosure process. So we'll have to kind of figure out some of those operational issues. Just as Connie even said, maybe it makes sense for us when we develop this friendly reminder letter that we also do some in-house title research, just to quickly see if there's a mortgage on the property. It's probably less helpful just to see all the liens, but if there's truly a mortgage that's been filed with the Register of Deeds on a property, my initial sense is let's take the time to send them a letter as well, just notifying them that a property on which they hold a mortgage is delinquent, because I think we'll see greater engagement in terms of people paying those off.
Chair Gibbs.
So Connie, do we have a list of the 214 different properties that we're talking about in phase 2 and phase 3? Because I see some real challenges with some of these properties that are highlighted in orange right now by the administrator's color coding. Prime example is item it's on page 18 of the packet, 18 of the list from the counter book. And that property has a 2013, 14, 16, 17, and 24 delinquent amounts. Now, 24 is only $2.12, but again, we've got some that is 2013 that's border on potential loss that we'd have to write off in a very near future. So the question, I guess, is still, do we have a list of what those 214 properties in phase 2 and phase 3 are? And is that one property that particular property that I'm looking at, is that one, because it has $2,107.66 of tax and $75.52 of special, but that doesn't include any of the interest in the penalty that's been imposed for, in this case, almost 11 years.
I guess which one are you looking at? You said page 18?
Well, I guess my bigger question is, do you have a list of those properties, the 89 that's in phase 2, and then the 125 in phase 3, so that we, as a committee, can look at, the issues of where we're at in relative time as far as the oldest 2013 property taxes?
We are working on the oldest properties, so that is potentially on there. We're also going after the highest dollar amounts. So I would have to look at the list, and we have to update it. That's why I was in conference last week, so I can submit that for the next meeting unless you want it sooner. I can submit it to...
Yeah, if you could provide that list to us, I mean, then, you know, we can look at where they're at on the counter book, and then also just compare things.
Yeah, and Connie, as soon as you get that to me, I have given my highlighted sheet to Alexis from Corp Counsel. My thought is if any of the ones highlighted in orange are on that list, I'll just, well, like I did here, I half highlighted one in orange and half in yellow. I'll note it in blue. I'll have Alexis note it in blue so you see which one it is. Just so, again, you'll have a visual as to kind of what we're working on.
Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did go out to Wisconsin Surplus and expected to see our batch 1 properties out there, but they're not out there except for, I think I saw 2 slivers. So are we adding those properties out there?
I can't put them up for sale. We have statutory limitations. I have to notify 3 of our county departments that these properties are available. They have 30 days to respond to me. And then I have to notify all the municipalities, and they have 6 weeks to respond to me if they want to purchase them. So I can't post them for sale until after that 6-week time period has passed.
My Supervisor Marshall, if I could just interject, I think what we need to do in light of some of the recent changes is we had a work group that began working on this issue that led to the NREM process being adopted by the county. I think what we might want to do is look at trying to reconstitute that work group and look at who the members are and try to streamline the process, because what we've been focusing on to this point with the report is that those that are tax delinquent, not that those that have been acquired through tax delinquency. And we kind of shift gears because we move from Connie to Kim. And in light of some of the changes, there are some deadlines relative to that. We might want to review our own internal policies with how long departments have to act, how long local governments have to act, and how we'll comply with that. But the WCA has adopted a model ordinance that I think we need to adopt by the end of the year as a committee and try to get before the county board that would spell out some of those guidelines. But I think we're bound by our policies that are not necessarily consistent with some of the changes that occurred on the state level.
And I guess I'm just looking at what we passed in the MRM process passed said that once we take the properties that they would be on Wisconsin Surplus. So is that requirement of offering them to the municipalities, et cetera, is that a state statute? Or is that something that the work group looked at?
I believe it's in our county ordinances that we have to offer them to the municipalities and county departments before I can list them. I can look at the letter that I sent to those because it's listed in there as to what the requirement is. I just don't remember right off the top of my head, but I can look at it here in just a moment.
So I think we need to do some reconciliation between our county, I believe some of those are in our county code of ordinances, and we didn't look at those when we updated it relative to consistency with the new processes. So you're raising a good point that we would ask Corp Counsel's office to take a look at both the statutes and the ordinance, the code of ordinance, to make sure that we're consistent and timely.
It is it's in the ordinance, the notice to municipality under section, chapter 3, but I agree with you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if that is Connie, do you know if that's a state statute?
I am not sure, but I do know that we may have to look at our ordinances anyway, only because the properties we just took, we have 240 days to sell. Next year, starting January 1st, if we take anything, we have 180 days. So we have to look at our ordinances too if you have to notify the departments. Also, we have to make sure we are compliant with that ordinance, Act 207.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it aligns with what you referenced, Mr. Chair, that there's probably some cleanup, and I think Connie and Erica and I and Dan, Mike, and Chris met a little bit today. I mean, there are some past practices we've had in the county that we just have always, they've been the way we've always done it, but in light of all these changes, I think it behooves us to really, let's clean up the ordinances, make sure we have the statutory references, and in light of particularly that change that dropped to 180 days, expedite as much as possible.
So I think as part of that review process, we'll also try to identify what the resource needs are to make sure that we can get that done in a timely manner, which was one of the reasons for the amendment, but we'll bring more in for clarification so that there's a clear understanding of what those roles are and how we go about selling it. We not only have the issue of tax delinquent property, but we also have the ongoing issue of how do we dispose of surplus property that we've acquired through other means. So I think that those policies should be as consistent as possible, and what are our goals, whether housing, economic development, et cetera. There's a good amount of work that needs to be done in this area. Connie?
I just want the committee to know that we have confirmation of receiving payment for one of the properties we were going to take that got an extended 30 days to get her done property. We will be receiving a check for around $179,000. Just to let you know that $95,389 of that is interest and penalty that's for the county. So, and they did sell the property. So we will be receiving it and not taking it, which we will not have to do any evictions. So just want to let the committee know.
Thank you. Any other?
Hey, Chair Robinson, this is Vice Chair Dickinson, if I could.
Go ahead, Chris.
So you mentioned, statute, you mentioned ordinance, make sure we follow those. You also mentioned there was a process that was decided upon. Perhaps that was in a task force or a work group. Is that published somewhere? Or did I mishear what you were, or represent what you were stating?
I think we had a work group the work group, as a result of the work group's efforts, we changed from and created the NREM process. So we implemented some of those through the adoption of a county ordinance that allowed for us to take it through the NREM process versus the traditional tax deed process. So that has been done. That's reflected in our ordinance. But I think we probably want to go back and revisit some of those discussions to make sure that we've captured everything in either our policies, procedures, and or our county ordinance. So it's a good point, Supervisor Dickinson.
And if I could add one, I don't know, Vice Chair Dickinson, if you were referencing my comment, I'll just elaborate. We've had a Marathon County past practice, as it was relayed to me by my predecessor, was we waited 3 years of delinquent. We waited until your tax certificate was 3 years delinquent before we would proceed. That is not anywhere in ordinance that I could find. It's certainly not consistent with statute. And I think the clear direction from this committee is let's move, be guided by statute. So I don't know if you were referencing the chair's comments, Vice Chair Dickinson, or if you were alluding to a comment that I made, but that was the...
No,
okay.
My reference was to what Chair Robinson had stated, just about the general process.
Okay.
And so for me, I just want to ensure that we are stepping through correctly in this process. You know, at some point we have to we're going to take this property back, then we're going to sell it, and make sure that we're following through as the county and the state would want us to. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that in light of the Hennepin County Supreme Court decision and recent changes to Act 207, there are additional obligations on local governments, and we just have to make sure that our policies, procedures, and ordinances are consistent with that. And WCA has prepared a model ordinance that we'll look at and look for a corporation council to do. But Dan, did you have
Oh, I was just going to say, I took some notes here. I will discuss this with Corporation Counsel Purner. It is in our ordinance, I believe, Section 3.20, that we give preference to municipalities and then county departments. We'll check to see whether or not that's also reflected in statute, and then if not, we don't have to follow it. You can certainly change that. And then as opposed with respect to the Supreme Court case, so we have to now sell the property for fair market value. It cannot be under what the fair market or assessed value is. So obviously that's something we have to keep in mind. And then anything else, like we can certainly take a look and then go through our current ordinances, go through the proposed ordinances in light of the recent legal changes, and then give recommendations based on that.
Chair Gibbs.
To the vice chair's comments, I think the work group involved the treasurer, the clerk, corp counsel in looking at our internal processes versus tax deed versus in rem, and those recommendations are what. So there wasn't a formal committee, task force, or group looking at it from the committee. It was staffs looking at the processes that we were using, and they brought the recommendations to switch to in rem to try to facilitate looking at the significant number of back property taxes and back properties that we had.
Deputy Administrator Holman was also involved in that process, as was I. But one of the other changes that we made was the whole use of surplus property as a mechanism to sell. So there were a number of changes, Supervisor Dickinson, but the primary one was the NREM process and then going through the surplus property.
And as far as the NREM process, in my discussions with Attorney Purner and what I've read, it's just sometimes more convenient when you have a large batch of properties because you can do it all at once. You wouldn't have to do it with respect to specific properties.
That's correct.
Thank you, everyone, for that clarification. I do want to just do one follow-up. Corporation Counsel's office, I apologize for missing the gentleman's name, made reference to selling at fair market value. And I do just want to make a note that we have a resolution to sell a property to the city of Wausau, R47-24. How does that jive with what was just stated? Is that something that has to be reviewed?
Sure. Dan, this is Administrator Leonard. I'll start, and Dan, you can take it. So the property that is on the county board agenda is not tax. It wasn't taken through tax foreclosure, either in rem or tax deed. That is a piece of property that was originally obtained and utilized in connection with the University of Wisconsin now the Stevens Point Wausau campus, previously the University of Wisconsin Marathon County campus, that the UW has expressed to Marathon County that it no longer desires or needs for purposes of delivering education on site. The requirement for under the law to sell at fair market value is a result of the Tyler v. Hennepin County case that was decided by the Supreme Court. I want to say that was 23, but it might have been 2022. And the reason for that difference in a nutshell is that the Supreme Court determined that government intervention and taking via tax foreclosure is in effect a constitutional taking, and the amount of value conferred upon the government through that taking process cannot exceed the amount of value to which the government was entitled. And in this instance, that is the back taxes, penalties, and attendant costs that would go with that property. So in the past, and it was, I would characterize it as exceedingly rare, but it certainly was rare. It might not have been exceedingly rare, but we would take a property and we would sell it, and on those rare occasions where the sale price was greater than the amount owed, counties in the state of Wisconsin and in other states across the country, they would kind of withhold, they would take and hold those gains. What the Tyler v. Hennepin County case says is that no, those amounts that are above and beyond that which was owed to the government need to be returned to the landowner following that sale. Likewise, the process alluded to in that case requires the government to ensure that we're not doing something that would otherwise inhibit the sale for fair market value. So, short answer to your question, the property that you're talking about this evening at the county board, and that was previously discussed here, the parking lot sale is not bound by the same rules with respect to the tax deed acquired property that the committee's been talking about to this point. But that was a long explanation. Dan, did I miss anything?
No, just kind of in short is that Supreme Court recognized that surplus is actually a property interest that belongs to the owner. And so the government could not just take the surplus without fair compensation. And so that's now why you have to pay the fair market value because it was considered a classic taking.
Chair Gibbs.
Thank you.
So that invites another question. I know we're listing properties as we might embark on adding 18 additional other properties once we get through the time period that notifying the departments and notifying the towns on our current ordinance. Do we have a determination of what the fair market value of those parcels are, and do we have then a reserve on the purchase price of those parcels when we list them on the surplus properties sale, so that we are in compliance and do in fact have the ability to pay out the property owner if there's excess sale proceeds that would belong to that property owner?
So working with Mike on the first batch that we posted last spring, the initial bid was at 50% of the assessed value with the minimum sale price at or above the assessed value of the property. So that's how we handled that first batch.
Chair Gibbs.
So assessed value, and I totally understand assessed value. I'm questioning whether assessed value is considered, and maybe this is a legal question for Corp Counsel to do some additional research. Is assessed value won't necessarily mean it's fair market value because it could be in a state of disrepair or it could be in increased value over and above the assessed value. So I guess the question becomes now is we need to really make sure that we're putting a reserve on these properties that's sufficient so that we don't put the taxpayers in a potential litigation situation by selling these properties under the estimated fair market value of those properties.
Yeah, and if I could, I would state, if you look at your property tax, there's an assessed value, and then there's an assessment ratio, which is a multiplier to get to your fair market value, and that is published. I believe Department of Revenue publishes those aggregate ratios. So something to consider.
Chair Gibbs.
Those fair market values aren't necessarily, even though I totally agree with the Vice Chair's comments, they're on the property tax slips, but I think in today's current market, I don't know that they're necessarily accurate as far as the true fair market value of all properties in any given situation.
I think the model ordinance tries to get at some of the issues of valuation. I think what we ought to do is refer that back to the work group, ask them to take a look at it and bring back a recommendation on how we, policies, ordinances, and others that need to change going forward. So
And I will just say that Supreme Court case, it just pretty much recognized that the owner has a property interest in the surplus under the Fifth Amendment taking clause. But I don't think that the assessed versus market value and what that threshold's going to be, that has not yet been formally litigated because we just got the Supreme Court decisions in 2022. So any ordinance or statute that's implemented as a result of this Supreme Court ruling would still probably be exposed to test the courts to see whether or not it satisfies the standard under Hennepin.
I'd just like to point out that the current policy was sort of at the direction of this committee to do, and I think we are learning more, and we're becoming more enlightened. I know Andy Phelps has been working on the model ordinances, and I think that we will all benefit from additional clarity from the legislature through Act 207 and through the development of those model ordinances. But we'll be bringing that in. But I think it's an issue we have to deal with by the end of the year, given the quick time frames. And then we'll need to identify the processes and the resources that are necessary to implement it. And I just want to thank all the parties that are involved and engaged in this discussion and moving this along. It's been a long-term issue, and I think we're trying to play some catch-up, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us.
If I can, not to belabor the point, but I generally do. So to Vice Chair Dickinson's point about kind of mitigating risk, so I think that's one of the reasons, going back to why the committee going through Wisconsin Surplus as opposed to our past practice had been listing them on our website. Wisconsin Surplus holds those auctions open. We believe, I just asked Kim, and our recollection right now is that they're open for 30 days to allow people to bid, to essentially create a very clear market from which individuals can then bid on those properties, to your point, Vice Chair, to really help mitigate risk of saying, hey, we're not creating a market where there would be a good opportunity for fair market value to be achieved. The kind of closed or less publicized version of sale that had been our website, I think this new process is less risky having it through there. But I certainly think we can bring back additional information, and if there's a process that is better, we're certainly open to that.
Any other questions or comments? Supervisor Marshall.
On that note, I would just encourage the staff to use our social media marketing. You're on Nextdoor, you're on Facebook, as a way to let the public know that these properties are out there, as well as a simple sign out front. Hey, if you're interested in this property, it is for sale on Wisconsin Surplus. We can increase demand by making sure that the maximum number of people know it is for sale. That'd be great. Thank you.
All right. Anything else on that issue? It's a complicated one, and thank you for your interest. All right, our next meeting is Wednesday, November 11th. We'll be focused on Monday. So I read, but it's Monday, the 11th. We'll have a full agenda relative to the budget, including the adoption of the capital improvement plan, which always gets lost in that discussion. But and then we'll be playing some catch up on some a number of other items after the fact, including audit compliance and follow up and other things. So anything else committee members would like to have us talk about? We still have our work plan. If not, we'll move on to item 9. What are your wishes? Moved by Chair Gibbs, seconded by Supervisor Marshall to adjourn. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. 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 Opposed, no. We are adjourned. And come back in an hour. Thanks, Connie.
Do you want to look to see if
Public speaking is going to be very challenging.
Because you have canvass.
We have Canvas, so we are going to be very tight to be done by 3 o'clock. So,
Do we need to?
well, my